You all. I'll just say a little bit about mental health. I was the health secretary as well, if you remember that, going back a few years. So I have, over the years, given a lot of thought to mental health, and particularly as to why is it growing all the time now as the issue, really. I would say it's the health issue, alongside dementia. Mental health, the health of the mind, is the 21st century issue. And the reason why I think people are talking about it more and more is because the National Health Service hasn't caught up with that yet. So it's kind of playing catch up. If you think about it, and this is the way I always like to explain it, if you think about when the NHS was created, and think about Rochdale then, or Lee, where I used to be the MP, 70 years ago this year, it's the anniversary year of the NHS. If you think about life here back then, or in a place like Lee, life was physically quite dangerous in terms of people's housing, the work conditions in the mills or in Lee in the mines. And there was a risk, obviously, of poor sanitation, infectious disease, accidents at work. There were lots of physical dangers to people's health. But because of that physical danger probably had the effect of making the community more emotionally secure. So back in Lee, a place I know well, because it was dangerous to work in the mines, it couldn't be every man for himself down there. You had to lock arms with each other and stand together. And that same spirit was in the community as well, because you had to have it. Otherwise, if it was everyone for themselves, people wouldn't have survived. So it kind of built a kind of sense of emotional resilience in the community that was just there in the way it was, because it had to be like that. And the NHS was kind of brought into being at that kind of time. And it obviously, for that reason, prioritised physical illness over mental well-being. And the other side of it as well, of course, was that the social side of people's care. So if you think of people's needs as physical, mental and social, that was outside of the NHS altogether. That was just left to families and extended networks of people in the community. And really, life has been changing ever since that time when the NHS was created. But the NHS itself, love it as I do, and I do, there's no greater champion of it than me, it hasn't kept pace with that change. And it's come to a kind of point here where mental health is massively under-prioritised now according to current needs. So I don't have the exact figures, but last time I checked, the percentage of the NHS budget spent on mental health was around about 6%. I think it may have improved a little in recent times, but it's around that kind of figure. At best, let's say 10%. Within that, children's mental health receives a fraction of that money. So children's mental health is even often seen as a lower priority than adult mental health. Why? Because that was wasn't really hit. Well, it was, but people didn't see the issue at the time that children could suffer from poor mental health. So those kind of historical ways of funding, those priorities that were set at the start of the NHS, haven't ever really fundamentally changed. And we've got this position now where, in the 21st century, life in places like Lee and Rochdale is almost a complete reversal of what it was in the 20th. It's physically far safer in terms of people's housing and their work, but it's emotionally far less secure than it was. And consequently, there is this massive gap between the need for mental health services and the actual provision. And if you kind of take it to real specifics, I think it's got worse in the last 10, certainly 20 years, but even in the last 10 years. I think there are thousands of people in Greater Manchester living with the toxic combination of insecure work and insecure housing. So over recent times, we've obviously seen the growth of casual or 0 hours contracts, where people don't have that kind of basic peace of mind anymore, that they'll be able to earn enough every week to feed the kids and pay the rent. So they're living week to week. not knowing whether they'll be able to do that. And because we haven't been building enough social housing, there's many, many more people here living in private rented accommodation now. I think we're up to about 15 to 20% of Greater Manchester is now living in private rented accommodation. And that is a massive change from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And obviously, as we know, if you live in private rented, you have far fewer rights in terms of the stability of your tenure than you do if you're in other forms of housing. So if you kind of just imagine that for a minute, you know, living with, well, many of you maybe are, living with insecure work and insecure housing, it means we're living life close to the edge there, and that will wear down your mental resilience. I would say, you know, the way I describe it when people ask me about rough sleeping and homelessness, I think we're all living just a few bits of bad luck away from kind of falling into that spiral ourselves. And I'm afraid to say that austerity has torn a bloody big hole in that safety net that used to be there under all communities, and now people are falling off the edge and they're falling straight through and they're ending up in the doorway. So that is, you know, I wish I could give a more positive and upbeat message, but you just need to tell it as it is to start with, don't you? Before you can sort of begin to understand what needs to change to make it better. So just to say a little then, before maybe opening up to questions and comments, the thing that would make it better, I think, is number one, more priority given to mental health funding. So using devolution, we have done that. So we've introduced a new mental health policy, came in the summer of last year, where a significant amount of extra funding has been reprioritised, and much more funding has been put into mental health. Now, it's only a start. It's nowhere near what is actually needed. It's just the beginning of reprioritisation. Obviously, the difficult thing is you can't just whip a lot of money from one bit of the NHS and put it somewhere else. You have to do it gradually, otherwise you destabilise the other physical health services. But we've begun upon that path. There's something else that we're doing, which I think again is about taking the NHS from a 20th century service to a 21st century service. And the idea is social prescribing. I don't know if it's something that you're all familiar with, but put simply, the NHS is programmed, or it was when it was created, when you go to see your GP, almost pills is the only kind of answer that comes out of the computer. You know, that's what you're given. Whereas social prescribing is about recognising more of what 21st century living is like, and thinks more about giving you the ability to kind of regain control. So it might be housing advice, financial advice, it might be exercise referral, it might be talking therapies, it might be counselling, bereavement counselling, whatever it might be. It actually is a way of thinking, the NHS thinking differently about how it supports people at the first port of call. So that is also something that we're beginning to introduce in Greater Manchester, social prescribing, which is a way of saying that people's mental well-being needs to be more at the heart of what the NHS, rather than a physical treatment service, it needs to be a mental well-being service. But beyond that, you know, I think, you know, we're only beginning to scratch the surface. I've long argued for a health service that fully integrates health and social care, actually doesn't see them as separate. It sees them as one service. Because when you bring social care fully into the system, and that obviously brings in the whole question of daily support with just living your life, you know, washing, dressing, just getting up and about, being who you are, being who you want to be. The key thing about that is it will allow the NHS to move from a patient-centred approach to a person-centred approach, and there's a world of difference between those two things. And I did argue in Parliament, I tried to do this as Health Secretary, I believe social care needs to be funded on the NHS principle, where everyone contributes, but then everybody's covered for all of their care needs, be they physical, mental or social, and we shouldn't differentiate between one care need. You know, at the moment we're effectively saying that physical needs are more important than mental or social needs, and I actually don't think that that is the case. What the 21st century is doing, it's asking different questions of the system. Because people are living longer, it's not just people living into their 80s or 90s. I'm talking about adults with learning disabilities are living longer, or children with complex needs. The point about that is, when you are living longer with those needs, you actually have you can't say where people's physical needs stop and their mental needs start, but we try and like put people into silos and make each different bit of the services deal with a different bit of people's needs. And I just don't see how that can possibly work. It leaves people telling the same stories of everybody who comes through the door, and it doesn't actually make it a service that gets to the heart of what they need. The truth is, when you get to a certain point, your needs become a blur of physical, mental, social. You can't kind of disaggregate them. So I'm a big believer that you need a health service that can kind of is essentially blind to what type of need it is. It just supports people according to what is their personal, individual need. And that means, as I say, major reforms to the way social care is funded. I've argued for that, and I will always argue for that. And I think the best birthday present you could give the NHS in its 70th anniversary year is that massive shift in the way that it's funded, so that it's truly set up to be a 21st century service. My test of whether or not we'll ever have a 21st century NHS is a pretty simple one. I believe we'll have it when we have a health service that can support people with dementia and mental health problems as well as it currently treats cancer. But if we're honest, we are still some way away from that. So we're beginning to make changes here in Greater Manchester. Maybe you won't have felt completely them hitting the ground yet. Devolution we can't solve everything through devolution. All we can do is begin to give a different emphasis to the way we're working, and we're going to be doing that through more money for mental health, social prescribing, just beginning to roll out a mental health support programme in schools. That is a Greater Manchester initiative, which I think is a really powerful initiative, really responding to what young people are telling us. So we're beginning to nudge it in the right direction. But I think the big change needs to come when we fund this system properly. We bring social care in, and then we can really make it the 21st century we all need it to be. So hope some of that triggers some thoughts and maybe some questions. And I'll be more than happy to take anything that anyone wants to ask about.